Chapter 6. In the Cage. With a little bit of prodding from a couple of the elves, Reyes was forced to duck his head and enter the cage. He turned almost immediately to face his captors. "Get back," one of the guards threatened, prodding Reyes gently through the bars with his spear. Reyes took a couple of steps back, still watching the guard warily. Had he wanted, he could easily have disarmed the guard, but right now that didn't seem to be a wise thing to do, as there were simply too many other elves nearby watching him. When Reyes was clear enough of the door, the guard pulled it closed and locked it again with the rusty key. The guard looked up at Reyes as he returned to his partner. It almost seemed as if the guard was trying to challenge Reyes to do something. Bolita the mage approached the now closed and locked door. He distracted Reyes' attention from the guard by muttering something under his breath while he stroked the lock. Reyes was standing right there, just on the other side of the door from Bolita, and yet he still couldn't catch a single word. It was almost as if Bolita was speaking in a tongue that Reyes couldn't recognise. Maybe the mage had come from another part of the Empire. There were 7 countries in the Elven Empire, and 4 different languages. Of these, Duberan was probably the most commonly spoken. Reyes had only learnt Elestrand because Elestrade was right there, on the border with them off. Once he had finished his minor enchantment, the mage turned and left the cage. Reyes watched the elves carefully as they began to slowly filter back to what they had been doing before the cart arrived. The mage and the boss walked together towards the big tent. Reyes wasn't sure how long he would have before the mage would return to bandage his wing, but somehow he assumed it wouldn't take Bolita too long to go through the loot and indicate those items that had a blue glow. Reyes considered his situation. There were 5 elves located on the ruined remains of some of the old village buildings. These elves were armed with bows, but they were paying more attention to what was going on outside the village. They had been posted as lookouts to warn the camp of possible attack, and weren't paying too much attention to what was happening inside the cage. He discounted the elf standing guard over the women. He was only armed with a whip. Likewise, the 2 elves standing guard outside the tent were armed with a sword and spear, and with little immediate danger thanks to their distance from the cage. The biggest threat seemed to Reyes to be the 2 guards who were actually keeping a careful eye on the cage. It was these last 2 Reyes paid most attention to. If there was to be any escape attempt, it would be these 2 that would notice the escape first and would raise the alarm. It was these 2 that would have to be dealt with first. It wouldn't be easy. The 2 guards were close enough to keep an eye on those in the cage, but they were keeping far enough from the bars of the cage that there were 3 cart whips between them and the prisoners. Since many of the prisoners had the strength to reach through the bars and snap the necks of the guards, Reyes could understand their caution. Reyes wasn't even sure they were close enough for his sleep spell to work on them. Reyes turned his attention from the guards to the lock itself. Not that he could risk playing with the lock while the guards were watching him, but it didn't hurt to look the thing over. What the mage had done was definitely more than just a bluff. There was a distinct blue glow coming off of the lock. As Reyes considered the situation carefully, he felt a large arm rest lightly on his left shoulder. Turning to see who was there, he saw the large friendly bovine face of Orsa. "Orsa?" Reyes asked. "Hello, Tanny," Orsa commented, a big grin on his face. "Glad you could make it. Not many of your race did." "What happened?" Reyes asked, indicated most of the other prisoners in the cage. "How did you all end up in here?" The Minotaur lowered his head and sighed. "We fought hard. We did our best for the greater glory of the Elven Emperor and his empire. The defenders fought well. For the most part they outmatched us both for skill and determination. Few of us were any match for them, but we had numbers on our side." Reyes nodded and told him, "I saw the aftermath. Once the battle was over, there were maybe a third of our regiment still breathing. Many of us had suffered small wounds of one kind or another, but we were heroes of the invasion. The Inquisitors moved among us, healing our wounds as best they could. We were told to celebrate with the others. For the first time since I've set foot in the city of Goldspawn, I actually felt as if I belonged somewhere." "So how did you end up here?" Reyes asked. He wasn't sure if this was a standard trait with Minotaurs, or if it was just Orsa, who insisted on elaborating every little detail with his life story. "Our beloved leader was full of praise for us. I remember thinking at the time just how unlike our officer he seemed to be. He was actually generous with his praises. He told us we couldn't get drunk, not yet. First he needed a patrol to check out the nearby village of the Moth. It seemed like a waste of time. Our forces had cleared out the village of the Moth before we attacked the castle. It didn't seem likely that anyone would have moved back into the village." Reyes nodded. "I understand. You met the slavers and they captured you, but surely you outnumbered and outclassed them." Orsa shook his head sadly. Finert sold us out. I'm still not sure why. I mean, what use is he without any troops under him? He got a transfer to the regular forces. Both he and that echo of a worm man of his wear blue now, Reyes explained. In fact, I saw all of our loyal elf officers wearing blue now. Orsa tutted. That still doesn't explain how they got the better of you, Reyes commented. Orsa sighed. Our regiment has always been a mishmash of those who've been able to think for themselves, and those whose minds have been enslaved. Finert must have had a list of those he could rely on, those who couldn't think for themselves. It may have been no more than a quarter of our total number, but they had orders from Finert to assist the slavers in capturing the regiment. When you are threatened from inside as well as outside, when you don't know who you can trust, who is a friend and who isn't, fighting becomes very difficult. Finert sold you to the slavers, Reyes commented. So it seems, Orsa agreed bitterly. We need to find a way out of here, Reyes said angrily. Finert needs to pay. You aren't the first to think that, Orsa replied. But this cage is locked tight. One of our best picklocks tried to open the door. As soon as he touched the lock, he was thrown back about 10 feet. He was killed? Reyes asked. No, Orsa replied. I guess there's no money in a dead slave. He was badly stunned, though. I doubt he would have gotten the door open if he had managed to start unlocking it. Those two guards were already on their way to stop him when the trap was triggered. I remember the guards called that mage guy over to check the lock. Reyes nodded. It sounds like a single-use spell. What? Orsa commented. It needs to be recast whenever it's triggered, Reyes explained. No, Orsa replied. He didn't recast it. Reyes shook his head. He glanced about the cage, noting the distinct lack of elven members of the Hope. Who else is here? Most of my friends were killed in the battle, but I'm pretty sure my girlfriend wasn't in the assault. Is she here, or is she still free? Gaggy, Orsa commented, shrugging his shoulders. I'm not sure. There are 3 other harpies in the cage, and one of them does seem to be pregnant. She didn't greet me like an old friend, though, when I tried to say hello. Rather, she turned her back on me and totally ignored me. I don't think Gaggy would have done that. Reyes felt his heart jump with hope and excitement. He moved past Orsa, anxious to get going to find this pregnant harpy for himself, but his upbringing stopped him from just brushing Orsa off. As far as I know, the only pregnant harpy in the regiment was Gaggara. I must go to her. I'm sorry, Orsa replied, watching Reyes walk by him. I suppose it could have been her. I'm afraid all you harpies look alike to me. I wouldn't even know you from the others if it wasn't for your Drake Man insignia. With that skirt, it would be easy to think you were female. Reyes nodded impatiently. Where did you see her? She was at the back of the cage. She was taking her incarceration quite hard, Orsa told him. I have to go to her, Reyes told Orsa urgently. It was good to see you again. I'm sure we'll get another chance later, Orsa replied. Reyes patted the Minotaur on the upper arm in a friendly manner. As he did so, he noticed something strange about the end of the Minotaur's arm. Something was missing. What happened to your hand? Orsa waved the stump of where his hand had been in front of Reyes. This? I lost it to a large, heavily armoured knight armed with a great axe. I was lucky I sidestepped in time, or I would likely have been cloven in two. I'm sorry, Reyes told him. Even now he felt the urge to get away and find Gaggara, but he couldn't bring himself to just walk off in mid-conversation. The Minotaur shrugged. It's the fortunes of war. I survived with the loss of just a hand. Many of our regiment lost a lot more today. Besides, I'm looking forward to getting a hook to replace it. As long as the elves don't ruin your fun by regenerating the limb, Reyes commented. Once again he wished he was in a good enough condition to try that spell again, but his wing still throbbed with pain. If anything, it was worse now since the boss had slapped him on the wing so mercilessly. I'd settle for getting my hand back, the Minotaur replied. Look, Reyes commented, feeling restless. I'd like to stay and chat longer, but I really must go and see if Gaggara is alright. I understand, Orsa replied with a grin. Go to your girl. You need to make up for lost time. Reyes began to head to the back of the cage as Orsa had directed him. He had to squeeze his way through some places where prisoners had gathered to chat. The cage was large, but with around 200 bodies in there, it was crowded. The humans who saw him approach did their best to step out of his way. In a way, it made him happy because he was able to navigate the cage a little faster as a result. If only they weren't moving because they were either scared or disgusted by him. As Reyes got closer to the back of the cage, he caught sight of a face he did recognise. Wallag. She seemed to be more than a little lost. Her eyes almost shone with hope the second she saw Reyes approach. Tanrag, she called. She hurried over to him, blocking his path with her insistence that he acknowledge her. "Oh, hello, Wallag." Race was very happy to see that Wallag had survived the battle. He liked her. He liked the fact that not once had she ever tried to come on strong to him. Yet he found it hard to show his joy at her survival. He was so concerned with reaching Gaggara. Nevertheless, he hesitated to just push by her in his hurry to reach Gaggara. "Good to see you, Tanrag," Wallag commented, sounding quite stressed. "No one else seems to be able to tell me. Have you seen any sign of Cagleen?" Reyes hesitated. He glanced down at the ground and then looked up again at Wallag's hopeful and expectant face. How could he tell her that he'd seen Cagleen lying dead on the battlefield? It was clear that Wallag was hoping for some good news. How could he tell her the truth? Yet, how could he lie to her? Reyes sighed. He shook his head slowly, and he could tell from the expression on Wallag's face that the hesitation wasn't lost on her. "No!" she cried. "I'm sorry," Reyes told her. "I saw her body with my own eyes." Wallag looked around lost. She's dead?" "I'm sorry," Reyes repeated. He knew that Cagleen had a sister, Piffling, the one who had tried to blackmail him, and he wondered if maybe Wallag was another sister. Maybe she was from the same village. Not a full sister, but maybe a half-sister. He remembered how Agnar had always been keen to keep the two of them together in the same hunting party. "I'm sorry for your loss. Were you two very close? She was your sister?" "Not my sister, no," Wallag replied. Even though she couldn't produce tears, it was only too clear how upset Wallag was. "But we were very good friends." I'm sorry, I liked Cagleen too," Reyes told her. Wallag turned and headed away from Reyes, seeming to be lost in her own little world. She wandered aimlessly across to the far side of the cage. There, she took hold of a bow in either hand and settled her head lightly in the gap between them. Clearly, she was trying to shut out the rest of the world from her mind. Reyes watched her for a moment. He considered going over to comfort her, but was unsure what he would say. Besides, he needed to reach Gaggara. Gaggara was sitting at the very back of the cage, as Orsa had said. Her wings and tail were both poking through the bars. Her knees were tucked up into her stomach with her arms around them, holding them in as close as she could, and her head resting lightly on top. Reyes recognised her instantly. "Gaggara," Reyes cooed gently. Gaggara eased her head slowly out of its hiding place and looked up at him. "Handsome, you're alive." She climbed awkwardly to her feet. "I was beginning to feel sure you were dead. I've seen so many people brought in today, and every time that cart arrived with more prisoners, I was hopeful that you were among them. You never were. Tishgara said that she thought she saw you shot out of the air. She thought you were dead. I wasn't willing to believe it, but when the prisoners stopped coming, I finally began to fear the worst." She stood up and wrapped her arms lovingly around him. "I thought I'd lost you too," Reyes replied. He pulled her closer to him. For a brief moment he wondered who Tishgara was, but then his curiosity lost out to his desire just to hold her. "I watched the battle from the safety of the trees," Gaggara said. Reyes could feel her body shaking as she spoke. "I saw how few of us reached the walls of the castle, and I wished I could have been there to help, and glad that you had kept me away at the same time. I saw more than half the Harpies fall out of the sky, and I'll admit, I feared you were among them." "Are you all right?" Reyes asked her. He began to examine her body closely, checking her for even the smallest of bruises. "How's the baby?" "I'm fine," Gaggara told him. "I'm so pleased to see you, but I'm scared. When the slavers saw that I was pregnant, they were overjoyed. Handsome, I'm not sure I want our daughter to be born into slavery. We should find a way to kill her before she's born." "No," Reyes declared firmly. "We should find a way to escape." "Oh, Handsome." She held him tightly. "Please tell me this isn't a dream. Please tell me you're really here and not some figment of my imagination. Or maybe a ghost to try and lure me into an early grave." "I'm really here," Reyes assured her. "Good," Gaggara said brightly. She kissed him gently. "This cage is a nightmare. It's too crowded, and there are too many humans in here. I can't help but think that they would love to tear my throat out given half a chance. I can feel their eyes on me all the time. Their hate. We should never have joined the Hope, Handsome. We should never have joined the invasion. Even the cage feels too enclosed. It's like I'm in one of those crows' cages that line the streets into the city." "You have quite a fear of crows' cages, don't you?" Reyes asked, concerned. "As would any rational person," Gaggara told him. "I guess that's true," Reyes admitted. "It's hardly something that someone aspires to, but this isn't the first time you've brought them up in conversation. I get the feeling you fear being put in a crow's cage far more than you do any other punishment, even something like being burned alive." Gaggara shrugged and nodded. Given the choice, I'd rather get my death over with quickly, if painfully. I don't want a long lingering death in a cage barely big enough to hold me. I don't like to be stuck anywhere where there is no way out. Claustrophobia, Reyes commented. If the Harpies had a word for it, he had no idea what it was. What? Gaggara asked. It's a fear of enclosed spaces, Reyes explained. Oh, Gaggara replied. Then, yes, I guess I suffer from that. I'm usually alright in a hut or a building. I don't even mind being in a small room so long as I know the way out and the door isn't locked. So long as I can leave at any time of my choosing. Put me in a cage, though, and I start to go out of my mind. And when I thought you were dead as well... Gaggara sunk her head into Reyes' shoulder. Reyes held her tightly. He remembered how one of the first things Gaggara had done, when the two of them had been escorted to his father's study a few days ago, had been to check the door in order to see if they'd been locked in. At the time, Reyes thought nothing of it. It was something he would probably have checked himself had he been in a strange home, but Gaggara's explanation of her fear put the whole thing into a new context. He patted the back of her head lovingly. Okay, sweetheart, let's see if we can't find a way to open this cage's door.